The torches burn low in the palace corridors, their smoke clinging to walls painted with gods who never sleep. Gold gleams on every surface, masks, vessels, and statues. Yet the air is heavy with incense and unease. Servants move silently, their eyes lowered, while beyond the doors, whispers coil through the court like desert wind. Here, power is draped in splendor, but carried like a burden. A pharaoh may sit on a throne of gold, but he dines with the fear of poison, walks through silence broken only by ritual, and sleeps beneath ceilings that echo with prayers he cannot escape. Even in dreams, the weight of the divine does not lift. Tell me, if you were offered such a crown, would you accept it, or turn away from the life behind the mask? Drop your answer in the comments and let me know. What country are you listening from? And is it day or night where you are? If you enjoy unwinding with history stories, don't forget to subscribe and join me for the next journey. Now dim your screen and relax into the night. Behind the gold and lapis crown, the pharaoh was only human, and his knights, though wrapped in silk, were seldom free of shadows. The world looked upon him as divine, a living god who ruled by the will of Ra. But when the great palace doors closed and the torches burned low, he sat in silence, listening to the echo of his own breath, aware of how fragile even kings could be. The throne was carved of granite, but the heart that carried its weight was soft, trembling beneath the mask of power. Each day was a performance, a ritual of appearances. To step outside his chamber was to wear the headdress, the cobra crown, the perfect smile carved like hieroglyphs into his expression. The people must believe their ruler was eternal, untouched by doubt. But the truth lay hidden in his private thoughts, where loneliness pressed upon him as heavily as the desert heat. The palace itself was magnificent, its corridors stretching wide with polished floors, its walls painted with bright colors that glowed in torchlight. Yet it was also a labyrinth, filled with whispers, footsteps, and unseen eyes. Guards stood watch, priests chanted prayers, scribes hurried with rolls of papyrus, and behind them all was the quiet knowledge that not everyone wished the pharaoh well. Poison could be slipped into wine. A trusted servant could be bribed. Even family could turn rival. And so the pharaoh walked in grandeur, yet always glancing sideways, his trust as thin as papyrus under strain. Can you picture it? A ruler draped in linen robes, gold bracelets heavy on his arms, walking alone through those echoing halls. The scent of incense thick in the air, the silence broken only by the shuffle of sandals on stone. Would you envy such a life, or would you feel the same chill of solitude pressing close, even in the heart of magnificence? The crown he wore was a prison of expectation. From childhood, he had been taught that he was chosen by the gods, destined to command armies, lead festivals, and guard the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Every gesture, every word carried weight beyond himself. A smile was not his own. It belonged to Egypt. A decision was never private. It rippled like the Nile, touching thousands of lives. In such a role, personal freedom dissolved like mist at dawn. At night, when he lay upon a bed of carved wood and cool linen, sleep was not always kind. Dreams of rebellion stirred. Faces of workers who built monuments flashed in his mind. He saw their bent backs, their sweat dripping into the sand. And sometimes he wondered, did they curse his name as they labored? Did they see him as a god, or as a distant figure whose glory was carved from their suffering? These were thoughts he could never speak, not to priests, not to generals, not even to wives who shared his chamber. A pharaoh's doubts were dangerous. Even whispers of uncertainty could shake the fragile balance of power. So he carried his silence, letting it weigh upon him like the stones of his own pyramid, rising in the desert beyond the palace walls. Still, there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when the mask slipped. Perhaps in the cool hours before dawn, when he walked to a balcony overlooking the Nile. The river shimmered under the moon, crocodiles drifting in its still waters, and fishermen's torches flickering like stars along the banks. There, in the solitude of night, he allowed himself to breathe as a man, not as a god. He thought of his childhood, when he had played with reeds by the river's edge, before the crown had been placed upon his head. He remembered laughter, freedom, the warmth of a mother's embrace, memories that felt distant, almost like dreams. The life of a pharaoh was filled with ceremony. Every day began with purification rituals, offerings to gods, processions before priests. The weight of eternity pressed upon each act, for he was told that if he faltered, the balance of the cosmos itself might crack. Imagine carrying such a burden, that the sun's rising, the Nile's flooding, the very fate of the afterlife for millions rested on your shoulders. Was it honor, or was it chains? Perhaps it was both. Outside the palace, the people saw grandeur. They saw a ruler stepping into the temple with jewels glittering, eyes lined with kohl, posture steady and serene. But they did not see the moments of trembling, the sleepless nights, the endless worry that enemies lurked even within the family. They did not see how isolation gnawed at the heart of a man, forced to appear more than human. Even joy was measured. A banquet was not a feast of laughter, but a careful performance, a smile timed with music, a nod given to allies, a sip of wine calculated for appearances. Laughter was rare, spontaneous joy rarer still. The pharaoh's world was scripted, every movement observed, every silence noted. And so behind the mask, the man within grew weary. Yet he endured, for endurance was the only choice. A pharaoh could not cast aside his crown, nor lay down his burden. His life was not his own. It belonged to Egypt, to history, to eternity. And though he longed perhaps for a single day of ordinary freedom, to walk through a market unrecognized, to taste bread warm from the oven without ceremony, to sit beneath a tree and feel the wind, such wishes remained only dreams. The golden mask was beautiful, yes, but beneath it was a human face, lined with the same cares as any man. And though the world may have worshipped him, in the quiet of his chamber, he understood a truth that no title could erase. Even a god-king could feel small. Long before the golden mask and the weight of the double crown, the pharaoh was once a child, small, curious, and vulnerable, though his cradle was a throne in waiting. In the cool mornings by the Nile, where lotus blossoms opened their pale blue petals to the sun, he played as any child might, chasing insects along the reeds, listening to the gentle slap of oars upon the river, laughing at the way sunlight caught upon a crocodile's scaled back before it slid into the water with barely a ripple. Yet even in those earliest years, his world was not entirely his own. From the moment of birth, he was more than a son. He was Egypt's heir, the vessel of Ra's divine will. Priests whispered blessings over him before he could walk. Scribes recorded omens in his name before he could speak, and guards stood at every door, shaping his childhood into something both precious and suffocating. Imagine a boy with hair dark as the fertile silt of the riverbanks, wrapped in linen softer than most would ever touch, held by nurses who bowed as they rocked him. His toys were not simple sticks or pebbles, but miniature boats carved of ivory, tiny animals made of faience, dolls fashioned with care. Yet the boy could not play in the open streets or wander freely among other children. His world was already set apart, wrapped in walls of sandstone and silence. His education began early, for a pharaoh's mind must be sharp as a falcon's gaze. Tutors sat beside him in shaded courtyards, teaching him to trace the sacred curves of hieroglyphs onto shards of limestone, his small fingers clumsy at first, then more steady. He learned the hymns of the gods, their names whispered until they lived in his breath. He learned the rituals of offering, lifting bread and incense with gestures so precise they could not be mistaken. He learned that his words carried weight beyond himself, that one day each syllable would ripple outward like water touched by a stone. But behind these lessons lay another truth, a quiet fear that haunted even the nursery. A pharaoh must be strong, perfect, unbreakable. A sneeze might be taken as weakness, a stumble as an omen. His laughter was measured, his tears discouraged. You are the son of Horus, the priests reminded him. You are the son reborn. But how could a boy of 7, of 10, carry the mantle of eternity? Perhaps you can picture him now, sitting at a low table beneath the shade of palm trees, scribbling hieroglyphs while the river glimmers nearby, his eyes drifting to the horizon where fishermen sing as they cast their nets. Did he long to join them? Did he imagine for a moment what it might be like to run barefoot along the banks, mud between his toes, free of crowns and ceremonies? These were questions he dared not voice, but surely they flickered in his heart, as natural as the flight of an ibis over the water. His lessons were not only of reading and ritual. The young heir was trained in the arts of war, not because he would be a soldier, but because he must command them. Wooden swords were placed in his hands. He learned the sweep of a bow, the stretch of a sling. Older warriors showed him how to stand tall, how to look steady even when fear gnawed within. A pharaoh who faltered in battle, even in appearance, risked losing more than land. He risked losing the faith of his people. And so the boy's childhood became a preparation, each game a rehearsal, each practice a shaping of his destiny. At night, when the palace grew hushed, he sometimes pressed close to his mother, the queen, seeking comfort in her arms. To him, she was not a figure of diplomacy or ritual, but warmth, the steady beat of a heart reminding him he was still only a child. She told him stories of the Nile's creation, of gods who shaped the world from chaos, of the Scarab beetle rolling the sun across the sky. Her voice lulled him into sleep, her words weaving dreams both beautiful and heavy, dreams in which he already carried the world upon his shoulders. But even here, shadows intruded. For in the palace, love was never entirely free of calculation. Brothers, uncles, half-siblings, all were rivals in the quiet game of succession. The boy's very existence was a threat to others who might seek the throne, and though guards kept watch, whispers of plots drifted through the corridors. Poison in a cup, a snake left where he played. Dangers lurked, though hidden beneath courtesies. A child so young could not yet understand betrayal, but he could sense unease, the tension in his tutors' voices, the way servants stiffened at the approach of certain nobles. It was here that loneliness first took root, surrounded by attendants, yet never allowed to trust them fully, surrounded by family, yet never certain which smiles concealed envy. The boy learned early to carry his thoughts quietly, to show only what was safe, to keep a part of himself hidden, a skill that would serve him in years to come, though at a cost. Can you imagine being such a child? A childhood wrapped not in freedom but in formality, where every step was guided, every gesture observed. Would you envy the treasures of such a life, or would you long instead for the simple gift of anonymity? And yet there was beauty too. The Nile itself was his greatest companion. He loved the sight of its broad waters gleaming under the sun, the sound of frogs croaking after the flood, the flash of fish leaping in the current. Sometimes, on ceremonial outings, he was taken upon a small barge, its sails swelling white against the sky. The river wind lifted his hair, and for a fleeting hour he felt the illusion of freedom, the closeness of something larger than palace walls. The Nile cradled him, as it had cradled Egypt for centuries, and he, the child, whispered to it in secret, as if it were a friend who could carry his secrets downstream. As years passed, training hardened. The priests pressed heavier lessons upon him, the duties of Ma'at, the judgment of the afterlife, the eternal scales that weighed truth against lies. The boy learned that his role was not only to govern the living, but to prepare for the dead, to ensure that when his time came, his soul would pass safely into eternity. The afterlife was painted vividly upon his walls. Green fields of reeds where the blessed walked, rivers flowing forever. But the promise came with warning. A Pharaoh who failed in life would be judged harshly beyond death. How heavy those tales must have felt to a child barely grown into youth. Still, there were moments of rebellion, quiet and secret. A stolen hour with a servant boy playing a game of knucklebones in a hidden corner. A forbidden laugh, a sprint down a corridor when no priest was watching. Small, fleeting rebellions, perhaps meaningless to others, but for the young heir, they were sparks of freedom, cherished and remembered. The child grew, but the shadow of expectation grew faster. By the time he reached his teenage years, the palace regarded him less as a boy and more as a figure, a symbol. He wore fine linens dyed with rare colours, collars of gold upon his chest, and still, inside, he remembered the river, the laughter, the simplicity that seemed farther and farther away. The Nile was eternal, but childhood was not, and though he sat upon cushions embroidered with stars, he already felt the weight of being trapped beneath them. In the silence of those years, he came to understand that the crown was never truly placed upon the head of a man. It was placed upon the child long before he could choose. And that child, the child of the Nile, learned to live not for himself, but for the endless echo of Egypt. The throne of Egypt was carved in gold, its legs shaped like lions, its back adorned with falcons that spread their wings as though protecting eternity. To the people who gazed upon it during ceremonies, it seemed eternal, unshakable, a symbol of divine order. But to the young Pharaoh, now moving from adolescence into manhood, that throne was also a battlefield. For in the palace, shadows stretched long. The boy who had once whispered to the Nile now sat in great halls lit by hundreds of oil lamps, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and advisors. Their words came heavy with flattery, yet sharp with hidden meaning. Each bowed deeply, each spoke of loyalty, but beneath their smiles stirred ambition. The throne was not simply a seat, it was the center of endless struggle, where every gesture of power drew both reverence and rivalry. Can you picture it? The Pharaoh, scarcely more than a youth, sitting upon that lion-legged seat as older men, seasoned generals, high priests with voices like thunder, scribes with lines etched deep in their brows, leaned forward, offering counsel. Each spoke of Egypt's needs, a border to guard, a temple to raise, a harvest to secure. But woven into their pleas was always a thread of self-interest. One sought glory for his family, another influence for his temple, another wealth hidden behind the veil of duty. And so the Pharaoh learned early that ruling was not only about leading his people, but about navigating the endless game of shadows, alliances, rivalries, silent battles fought not with swords, but with words and glances. In the cool chambers of the palace, gossip was as dangerous as poison. A careless phrase could be carried to the wrong ears. A hint of doubt spoken in the wrong company might be twisted into treason. Even brothers and cousins, once companions of childhood, became figures to watch carefully. For succession in Egypt was rarely a straight path. Blood ties did not always guarantee loyalty. Some princes had vanished mysteriously in the past. Others had risen only to be struck down before their time. The young Pharaoh grew to understand that trust was a fragile luxury, one he could rarely afford. At night, in the quiet of his private chambers, he sometimes recalled the simpler days when his only rivals were playmates in hidden courtyards. Now, every person he encountered seemed cloaked in hidden motives. He longed for sincerity, for a voice that spoke without calculation. But within the palace, sincerity was as rare as rain in the desert. The Vizier, his most trusted advisor, was both a comfort and a cause of unease. The man had served his father and his father's father before him. His wisdom was undeniable, his presence steady, but his influence was vast, stretching across the kingdom. Some whispered that the Vizier held more power than the Pharaoh himself, for he controlled the scribes, the taxes, the flow of goods from the Nile's fertile banks. Was he a loyal guide, or a quiet ruler cloaked in humility? The young Pharaoh could not know, and the doubt weighed upon him. Priests too cast long shadows. They spoke of gods and destiny, of omens in the sky and voices in the wind. They reminded the Pharaoh that he was Horus incarnate, the living link between heaven and earth. Their rituals gave him legitimacy, yet their power rivaled his own. For the temples were kingdoms within the kingdom, wealthy and vast, their lands tilled by thousands, their coffers overflowing with offerings. Without the priests, the Pharaoh's divinity was questioned. With them, he risked becoming their puppet. It was a delicate balance, like walking along the narrow banks of the Nile during flood. One misstep, and he could be swept away. Have you ever stood among people who smiled at you, yet felt the weight of their eyes pressing, measuring, waiting for you to falter? That was the Pharaoh's life, every day, from dawn to dusk. And so, in his youth, he became skilled in silence. He learned to listen without speaking, to let others reveal themselves while he gave little away. He learned to weigh each word, to hold his expression steady, even when anger or doubt surged within. The throne was not a place for honesty, it was a place for masks, where truth was hidden beneath layers of ritual and ceremony. But the strain was heavy. In the great festivals, when the people gathered by the thousands, cheering his name, he lifted his arms and smiled. Yet inside he wondered, how many of those voices belonged to men who cursed him in private? When he processed through the temples, priests showering him with blessings, did they speak of faith or of their own power cloaked in holy words? And in the palace itself, in the echoing halls lined with statues of gods, he sometimes felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. He was one of many pharaohs, part of a line stretching back into the mist of time. His face would be carved in stone, his deeds recorded in hieroglyphs. But what of the man himself? Would history remember his fears, his quiet doubts, his hidden longings? Or would those shadows be buried beneath the glitter of monuments? One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the palace in hues of red and gold, he stood upon a balcony overlooking the Nile. The river gleamed like a strip of bronze, the air warm with the scent of lotus. He thought of the fishermen below, men whose lives were simple, free of the webs of intrigue that ensnared him. Did they envy him, this young man draped in linen and gold? Or did they pity him, trapped as he was in a cage of power? The answer, of course, he would never know. But the question lingered, as persistent as the hum of insects in the dusk. The game of shadows deepened with every passing year. Allies shifted, enemies hid in plain sight. He learned to reward and punish carefully, to favor one general while keeping another close, to offer priests honor while quietly limiting their reach. It was a constant dance, delicate and dangerous, and one misstep could mean ruin. Yet through it all, he carried a truth he dared not speak. The throne was not only a gift, it was a burden, heavy with expectation, surrounded by shadows that never lifted. And though the people saw a god-king shining in splendor, the man within knew himself as something far more fragile. The palace lamps flickered, the shadows lengthened, and the young Pharaoh, seated upon his golden throne, understood that the greatest battles of his reign might never be fought with spears and chariots, but with whispers, alliances, and silence itself. From the moment the crown touched his brow, the Pharaoh was no longer seen as a man. He was Horus made flesh, the son of Ra, the very bridge between earth and sky. The people bowed not to his body, but to the divinity they believed flowed through his veins. And while they lifted hymns of praise, the Pharaoh bore silently the crushing truth. Divinity came at a cost. Imagine standing before thousands in the temple courtyard, incense curling upward like pale smoke toward the heavens. The priests chant, their voices low and thunderous, their words weaving you into the company of gods. The people kneel, their foreheads pressed to the stone, believing that your very breath carries blessings. And yet, within your chest, your heart beats as any mortal's would, quick, uncertain, longing for comfort. You are expected to feel no fear, no doubt, no weakness. But the silence within the mask is deafening. Each day began with rituals of purity. Before the first rays of the sun touched the horizon, priests would bathe the Pharaoh in water drawn from the Nile, scented with lotus oil. His skin was rubbed with fine unguents, his body wrapped in fresh linen. The act was not only to cleanse, but to renew him as divine. A mortal might wash to refresh. A pharaoh was washed to preserve the illusion of perfection. Even the smallest blemish could stir whispers. An illness, a scar, a limp. How could a god stumble? And so the rituals grew endless, layer upon layer, guarding the illusion as though eternity itself depended on it. The temple was both sanctuary and prison. Its stone walls soared high, columns painted with lotus and papyrus, ceilings adorned with stars. Processions wound through its halls, music echoing from sistrums and drums, the air thick with incense and myrrh. Here the pharaoh appeared not as a ruler, but as a god incarnate. He offered bread and beer to the statues of deities, poured wine upon the altar, recited hymns written by scribes. Yet behind the grandeur lay a quiet unease. For the offerings were not only to the gods, but to the people themselves, who needed to believe. What if, for a single day, he faltered? What if he forgot a word, stumbled in the ritual, hesitated before the sacred flame? Would Ra turn his face away? Would the Nile fail to flood, the crops wither in the fields? The people would whisper of omens, priests would question his worth, rivals would seize upon weakness. And so every gesture became a performance, rehearsed until it no longer belonged to him. The Pharaoh was said to be eternal, yet he knew the truth of his body, the way fatigue crept into his bones, the way sleepless nights left his eyes heavy, the way loneliness ached like hunger. The divinity people saw was painted upon him, layered like pigment on the walls of a tomb. But within, he was as fragile as any man, longing for the simple mercy of being seen, not as a god, but as himself. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would look at his hands, strong, yes, adorned with gold rings, but still only hands, mortal, lined with small scars from boyhood games or training. These were not the hands of Ra. These were the hands of a man who felt, who bled, who one day would die. Yet no one was permitted to acknowledge such truth. The priests wove his divinity into every tale. He was the falcon of Horus, the rebirth of Osiris, the flame of Ra. Children grew up singing songs of his greatness, never imagining that their god-king might pace his chamber at night, restless, weary, afraid. The price of divinity was isolation. No friend could ever speak as equal. No servant could ever treat him as human. Even wives and children were bound by ritual, expected to see him as more than a man. And so, while the world adored him, he sat alone behind layers of reverence. Can you imagine the silence of such a life? To be surrounded always, yet never truly known. To hear your name chanted in the streets, yet never hear it spoken with simple love. The festivals were the heaviest of burdens. During Opet, when the god Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor, the pharaoh marched in the procession, his body glistening with jewels, his crown heavy with gold. Crowds filled the streets, cheering until their voices grew hoarse. They believed his steps carried divine blessing, his presence ensured the harvest. And yet, each stride was rehearsed, his smile a mask, his mind whispering doubts he dared not voice. If the floods failed, if the harvest faltered, would they not look to him as the reason? The god-king who failed in his duty. This was the greatest weight of all. Responsibility not only for governance, but for the very order of the cosmos. A storm was not merely weather, it was a sign. A sickness was not simply chance, it was a test of his divinity. When a comet streaked the night sky, the people trembled, turning to him for reassurance. And though his heart may have quaked at the sight, he stood steady, speaking calm words he scarcely believed. At night, lying upon fine linen beneath carved ceilings painted with stars, the pharaoh sometimes closed his eyes and imagined a different life. What would it be to walk among the people unnoticed, to share bread with a farmer, to laugh at a child's game, to sit beneath a sycamore tree and feel shade without expectation? These were dreams, fragile and fleeting, but they came to him often. Dreams of humanity denied by divinity. Even death offered no release. For while most men passed quietly into the afterlife, the pharaoh was bound to eternity. Tombs were carved, vast and elaborate, to preserve his name forever. Walls were painted with scenes of triumph, not of weariness. Priests promised his soul would merge with the sun, rising each day in endless rebirth. But within, he knew, even in death, the mask would remain. No inscription would speak of loneliness, No carving would reveal his hidden doubts. He would be remembered as eternal, flawless, divine, though the man had been none of these. Perhaps that was the greatest price of all. Not the rituals, not the burdens, not even the isolation, but the erasure of his humanity. To live as a god was to die as one, leaving behind only the echo of divinity, while the man within faded into silence. And yet, despite it all, he endured. He wore the mask each day, lifted the scepter, walked the sacred halls, stood before the altars. For he understood that though the price was heavy, it was also inescapable. To falter was to invite chaos, to break the fragile illusion upon which Egypt rested. He carried the burden not for himself, but for millions, who looked to him as the axis of their world. Still, in the quiet of his chamber, when the lamps burned low and shadows flickered upon the painted walls, he whispered to the night as though it might answer. Not prayers, not hymns, but simple words no one else would ever hear. Words of longing, of fatigue, of the man behind the god. And in that silence, he remained what he had always been, human, fragile, yearning, paying the price of divinity with every breath. The palace gleamed with polished stone and painted columns, its halls echoing with footsteps, its air scented with incense and lotus. Yet behind the brightness lingered shadows, for within those same halls where hymns were sung and courtiers bowed low, there stirred whispers, secrets and dangers as invisible as the desert wind. The Pharaoh, adorned in gold and linen, was outwardly untouchable, divine in the eyes of his people. But divinity could not shield him from the frailties of men, envy, ambition, and treachery. In the court of Egypt, where every smile was a mask and every word a strategy, even the most powerful of kings lived with the quiet knowledge that a single misstep might end his reign. It began with whispers. A servant passing through the market overheard a noble speaking too freely. A scribe noticed a letter sealed with a strange mark. A guard reported that a cup of wine had been offered, then hastily withdrawn. Each fragment was small, fragile, like reeds swaying along the Nile. But woven together, they formed a pattern, a shadow stretching toward the throne. Can you imagine living within walls where silence hummed like a warning? To sit at a feast, the golden cup in your hand, and wonder whether the wine you raised to your lips had been touched with poison. To look upon your brother, your cousin, your vizier, and wonder whether their loyalty was truth or pretense. The Pharaoh learned to read faces as one might read hieroglyphs, each gesture a symbol, each glance a clue, a smile that lingered too long, a servant who shifted nervously when asked a question, a priest whose eyes gleamed not with reverence, but with calculation. Every detail mattered, for betrayal rarely came boldly. It crept like a serpent, silent and patient, striking when least expected. There were tales of kings before him, undone by plots woven within their own households. Some had been poisoned during feasts. Others had been smothered in their sleep. Some had vanished mysteriously, their tombs left unfinished, their names stricken from walls. The young Pharaoh knew these stories well, for they were whispered to him in warning by priests and tutors since childhood. And now, upon the throne, those shadows no longer belonged to the past. They breathed in the corridors around him. At night, the palace guards kept watch with spears in hand, their eyes scanning every shadow. Yet even their presence brought little comfort. For what if the danger did not come from without, but from within? A trusted general, weary of waiting for reward. A relative who believed the gods favoured his claim. a priest who longed to place another upon the throne. The threats were endless, as countless as the stars above the desert sky. One evening, during a banquet, the air grew heavy with tension. Music played softly, harps plucked in rhythm, dancers moved gracefully between torches, and servants poured wine into golden cups. The Pharaoh raised his own, its rim catching the flicker of firelight. Yet as the cup neared his lips, his gaze fell upon the Vizier seated across from him. The man's expression was calm, but his eyes, just for a breath, flickered toward the goblet with something unreadable. A flicker of calculation, of guilt, or was it only the trick of flame upon stone? The Pharaoh lowered the cup slowly, setting it aside untouched. Conversation continued, laughter rising among the courtiers, but his own heart beat louder than the music. Perhaps the wine was safe. Perhaps it was not. He would never know, and that uncertainty was the very poison of palace life. Even dreams were not free of treachery. Ancient curses were said to drift through the halls, carried in the voices of priests or etched into amulets. A whispered incantation, a secret offering made at midnight, could call upon gods or demons to weaken a ruler. The Pharaoh, raised in rituals, did not dismiss these fears lightly. In temples he walked with care, his hand brushing amulets carved in stone. His prayers whispered not only for Egypt's prosperity, but for his own protection. In the stillness of night, when the palace slept, he sometimes paced the length of his chamber, the torchlight flickering across walls painted with gods. He pressed his hand against the cool stone, steadying himself, breathing deeply. Outside, the desert wind hissed softly against the shutters, carrying grains of sand that rattled like tiny warnings. He wondered if somewhere in those same shadows, a rival lay awake as well, plotting. And yet, amid the fear, he carried on. Each day he walked the halls with measured grace, his expression serene, his voice calm. To show fear was to invite it. To reveal suspicion was to grant power to those who thrived upon it. So he masked his thoughts, wore serenity as armor, and continued the dance of politics and survival. The Pharaoh trusted few, and even those few with caution. There was the general who had stood at his side since youth, loyal in word and deed. There was the priest who had guided his earliest rituals, a figure almost fatherly. There was his mother, the Queen Dowager, whose gaze still carried warmth. Yet even with them, trust was tempered. For history had taught him that loyalty could falter, love could twist, faith could shift with the desert wind. Do you feel the chill of such a life? To live among shadows, to feast among rivals, to sleep beneath a roof where every corner might conceal a curse. And still, life continued. Egypt demanded its ruler. The Nile flooded, crops grew, temples required offerings. The people looked to their Pharaoh not as a man of flesh and fear, but as an unshakable god-king. They could not see the tension in his shoulders as he lifted the scepter, nor the sleepless nights etched faintly beneath his eyes. They saw only divinity, untouched and eternal. The truth, the fragile, unspoken truth, was that divinity did not shield him. It only magnified the danger. For to strike a god-king was to claim godhood for oneself, to seize eternity. And so the higher he was raised, the sharper the shadows around him grew. Perhaps that was the greatest curse of all. Not the poison in a cup, nor the whispers of rivals, but the endless uncertainty, the knowledge that love, loyalty, and safety were illusions, fragile as papyrus in a storm. And though the Pharaoh stood tall in his halls of gold, each step carried the silent question, Would this be the step that led to betrayal? Still, he endured. For to falter was to invite chaos, and to surrender was to abandon Egypt. The whispers continued, the shadows lengthened, but he walked on, his crown gleaming beneath the sun. And though the court might be filled with curses, the Pharaoh wore calm as his shield, silence as his sword, and endurance as his throne. The Vizier was the keeper of secrets. He moved quietly through the palace halls. His presence felt more than seen. His voice calm, his words measured. To the people of Egypt, the Vizier was a figure of reverence, the right hand of the Pharaoh, the overseer of scribes, the steward of justice, the keeper of temples and treasuries. To the Pharaoh himself, he was something far more complicated, both guardian and shadow, confidant and danger, the one man whose influence stretched nearly as wide as his own. The Vizier's office was carved into the very heart of the palace, a chamber lined with scrolls of papyrus, tall jars filled with ink, shelves stacked with tablets. Scribes came and went constantly, their reeds scratching across smooth surfaces, recording harvests, judgments, taxes, decrees. Yet amid the bustle, the Vizier's voice remained the final word. It was he who weighed disputes, he who balanced accounts, he who carried the Pharaoh's orders into the world. The kingdom bent beneath the crown, but also beneath the Vizier's steady hand. Can you imagine how such power must have felt to the young ruler? To look upon this man, older and seasoned, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, his manner unshakable, and wonder, does he serve me truly, or do I serve him without knowing it? The Vizier had been at his side since boyhood. He had corrected his handwriting when he traced clumsy hieroglyphs. He had taught him the balance of judgment, urging mercy here, sternness there. He had whispered counsel during ceremonies, guiding him when the steps of ritual felt overwhelming. In many ways, he was like a second father, patient, stern, ever present. And yet, even in those early years, the Pharaoh sensed the veil. For the Vizier's loyalty was not born of love, but of necessity, of politics, of power carefully preserved. In the great hall of judgment, when disputes were brought before the throne, it was the Vizier who often spoke first. A farmer claimed his neighbour had stolen grain. A merchant argued over the weight of copper ingots. A priest demanded land for a temple. Each time, the Vizier's voice cut through the air, calm and steady, shaping truth before the Pharaoh himself gave word. And though the king would nod, lifting his scepter to affirm the judgment, he knew that the decision had been laid before him, prepared like a script. Was he ruling, or was he ruled? The question lingered, as persistent as the desert wind rattling the shutters at night. At feasts, the Vizier sat close, his place of honour beside the throne. His face revealed little, his eyes hooded, his lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Servants poured his cup with care. Dancers bowed before his gaze as though he, too, were touched by divinity. And perhaps, in the eyes of many, he was. For while the Pharaoh was the god-king, radiant and distant, the Vizier was the man of the people, the one whose hand reached into every field, every temple, every corner of Egypt. There were nights when the Pharaoh lay awake, staring at the painted stars on his ceiling, wondering what thoughts moved behind the Vizier's mask. Did he dream of power beyond service? Did he whisper prayers of loyalty? Or did he harbour ambitions as sharp as a hidden dagger? History gave little comfort. There were stories of viziers who had betrayed their kings, who had woven plots with priests or generals, who had whispered into ears until thrones crumbled. There were also stories of viziers who had been loyal unto death, who had shielded their kings from danger, who had left their names honoured in stone. Which kind of vizier sat beside him now? The Pharaoh could not know. And so he watched. He watched how the vizier moved through the court, how his eyes lingered upon certain nobles, how his words shifted like reeds in the current of conversation. He listened for the subtle pauses, the careful turns of phrase, the moments when counsel seemed less like guidance and more like command. The veil of the vizier was not easily pierced, for every word he spoke was polished, every gesture controlled. Even in silence, he revealed nothing. Yet in small ways, the Pharaoh saw. A scribe who feared his gaze more than the king's. A priest who bowed lower to the vizier than to the throne. A general whose loyalty seemed divided between crown and counselor. The web of influence stretched outward, delicate yet unbreakable, and at its center sat the vizier, cloaked in humility, yet heavy with unseen power. Can you feel the tension of such a bond? To depend utterly on a man you cannot fully trust, to rely on his wisdom even as you suspect it might serve another purpose. Still, the Pharaoh endured it, for to strip the vizier of power was unthinkable. The kingdom itself might falter. Scribes would lose order, judges lose direction, temples lose guidance. And so he accepted the veil, the uncertainty, the silent bargain. The vizier ruled beneath him, beside him, through him, and together they sustained Egypt. In private, when the lamps burned low and only a few guards stood watch, the Pharaoh sometimes summoned the vizier to speak alone. Their conversations were quiet, measured, heavy with unspoken truths. The vizier would report the grain stores, the movements of nomads beyond the borders, the murmurs of priests, and the Pharaoh listening would nod, yet all the while wondering whether these were truths, or truths shaped carefully for his ears alone. There were moments when he wished he could ask openly, "Do you serve me, or do you serve yourself?" But such words could never be spoken. To question was to weaken the bond, to reveal doubt, to invite fracture in a kingdom that relied upon seamless unity. And so the question remained unspoken, lingering like incense in the air, fragrant, heavy, and never fully fading. Sometimes, when they walked together through the gardens at dusk, the Nile glowing bronze in the distance, the vizier would speak of the Pharaoh's father, of battles fought, of laws given, of temples raised. His words carried memory, shaping the past into lessons for the present. And in those moments, the Pharaoh felt almost comfort, as though he stood in the shadow of continuity, the bond of generations. Yet even here, the veil remained. For the vizier's loyalty was not to the man, but to the throne itself, the endless chain of power stretching back through centuries. Was that loyalty less true or more enduring? The Pharaoh did not know, but he understood in time that this was the way of Egypt. No king ruled alone. Behind the throne stood shadows, viziers, priests, generals, scribes, and it was through their hands that the kingdom lived. The Pharaoh was divine, yes, but divinity was not enough. Power was shared, balanced, masked, and the vizier's veil was its most constant face. And so he lived each day in a quiet tension, bound to the man beside him, wary yet reliant, guarded yet dependent. The vizier was his shield and his shadow, his voice and his silence, his ally and his greatest uncertainty. Perhaps that is why, when the Pharaoh gazed upon the great statues of himself being carved in the quarries, he felt both pride and sorrow. For though the stone bore his likeness, though eternity would remember his name. He knew that behind every command that raised those monuments, the Vizier's unseen hand had guided the chisels. The monuments would speak of the king, but the shadows, the whispers, the subtle balance of power, those belonged forever to the man behind the veil. And in that truth, the Pharaoh understood another weight of his crown: to be remembered as a god, yet to rule always as a man surrounded by shadows he could never pierce. The Queen of Egypt shone beside the Pharaoh like the moon beside the sun, luminous, graceful, adorned with jewels that caught the firelight and dazzled the crowds. To the people, she was Hathor incarnate, the embodiment of beauty and fertility, the sacred partner who completed the divine circle of kingship. But behind the painted walls and public ceremonies, her life was far more fragile. She was wife, mother, symbol, and prisoner, all at once. From the moment she entered the palace, the queen's path was set. Whether chosen from noble blood, from a sister line of royalty, or from a marriage made for alliance, her union with the Pharaoh was less of love than of duty. The gods themselves were invoked in her marriage. Priests sang hymns, garlands of lotus crowned her hair, gold bands adorned her wrists. Yet even in the fragrance of incense and the glow of torches, she knew the truth. Her role was not her own. She was bound, not simply to a man, but to an empire. Can you picture her now? Draped in linen fine as mist, her eyes darkened with kohl, her headdress heavy with beads of turquoise and lapis. She walks through the palace halls, attendants trailing at her side, her sandals whispering across polished floors. Every gaze follows her, not as a woman, but as a symbol. Her smile is measured, her voice gentle, her gestures graceful, for she is always watched, always weighed, always judged. At festivals, she stood beside the Pharaoh, her hand in his, her presence completing the image of divine order. When he was Ra, she was Hathor. When he was Osiris, she was Isis. Together, they represented balance, eternity, perfection. Yet even as the people cheered, even as the hymns echoed through the temples, the queen's heart carried quiet questions. Did the man beside her see her as companion, or only as necessary figure? Did she hold a place in his heart, or only in his rituals? Marriage to a pharaoh was not like other marriages. The harem, hidden within the palace walls, was filled with other wives, consorts, and women brought for political alliance. The queen's place was highest, yes, but it was also the most fragile. She was the great royal wife, and her role was both sacred and precarious. One whispered scandal, one failed birth, one rival favoured too openly, and her place could be threatened. Loneliness in such halls was a silent companion. In her chambers, the queen was surrounded by attendants, women who combed her hair, polished her nails, arranged her robes. Musicians played softly, weaving melodies from harps and flutes. Perfumed oils scented the air, flowers floated in bowls of water. To an outsider, it would seem a paradise. Yet for the queen, it was a cage lined with silks. Every step was observed, every word recorded. She could not wander the markets, laugh freely in the streets, sit in the shade of a sycamore without permission. Her world was beauty without freedom, splendor without choice. And at night, when the lamps dimmed and silence stretched long, she sometimes lay awake, her heart aching for something more than ceremony. She thought of her childhood, of the days when she had run barefoot in gardens, when her laughter rang freely. Those days felt distant now, wrapped away beneath layers of duty. Do you feel the ache of such a life? To be worshipped as divine, yet denied the simple joys of being human. Motherhood was both her hope and her trial. To bear the heir was her sacred duty, the task that defined her worth. When a child was born, the palace erupted in celebration. Priests offered prayers, musicians filled the air with triumph, gifts poured in from across the land. Yet with each child came danger, the pain of birth, the risk of death, the burden of expectation. And if no son came, or if sons were lost in infancy, whispers grew sharp. Priests might murmur of omens, rivals might press forward with claims. The queen's body itself became a battlefield, her womb a matter of politics as much as of love. And yet, in quiet moments, there was tenderness. Holding a child in her arms, feeling the warmth of small fingers grasping her own, she knew that beyond the crown, beyond the rituals, beyond the isolation, there was still a heartbeat of something deeply human. Those moments, fleeting and fragile, sustained her through the weight of her crown. The queen's influence, though hidden, was real. In hushed voices, she counseled the Pharaoh, soothing his anger, tempering his decisions. In private chambers, she spoke words no priest or vizier could, offering not political strategy but simple understanding. Yet even this was delicate. Too much influence, and she risked being seen as manipulative. Too little, and she faded into silence. Balance was her survival, as precarious as walking upon the thin banks of the Nile during flood. There were other women too, rivals within the palace walls. A favoured concubine who drew the pharaoh's eye, a noble woman brought for alliance, a foreign princess gifted as bride. The queen must endure them all, her smile unbroken, her composure flawless, her pain, her jealousy, her longing, all were hidden behind the painted mask of serenity. For a queen could not falter, not before servants, not before her children, not before the court. Can you imagine the strength it must have taken to live always within such a mask? To smile even as her heart cracked, to bow even as she longed to be free. And yet she endured. For endurance was the way of Egypt, as eternal as the Nile. Sometimes, in the stillness of dusk, the queen would retreat to the palace roof. There, high above the gardens, she could look out across the river, watching the fishermen's boats drift with the current, their torches flickering like stars. She breathed in the cool air, her headdress heavy upon her brow, and for a moment she let herself imagine. To be one of those women on the banks, grinding grain, baking bread, laughing freely with neighbours. To feel freedom in the body, in the heart, even if only for a day. The dream was simple, and perhaps that was why it hurt so deeply. In the stories told by priests, the queens of old were immortal. Isis wept for Osiris, Hathor blessed the land with joy, Nefertari walked beside Ramesses in glory. Their names were carved in stone, their faces painted upon temple walls. Yet the human truth, the loneliness, the longing, the quiet sacrifices, was never etched in hieroglyphs. That truth lived only in the hearts of the women themselves, fading like whispers in the desert wind. The Pharaoh, for all his grandeur, carried his own burdens. Yet in many ways, the queen's burden was sharper still, for it was hidden. His loneliness was cloaked in ceremony, hers in silence. His fear was spoken in counsel, hers locked within her heart. He ruled with scepter and crown. She ruled with patience and endurance. And while his name would be remembered in stone, hers risked fading into shadow. Still, in the quiet of her chamber, when the lamps flickered low and the night wrapped around the palace. The queen whispered her own prayers, not for power, not for glory, but for peace, for her children, for her heart, for the chance that in some distant eternity she might walk free, her crown set aside, her soul unburdened. And perhaps, as she lay in silence, she wondered if the Pharaoh beside her, burdened by his own mask of divinity, whispered the same. The palace never truly slept. Even when the torches burned low and the echoes of footsteps faded into silence, the rhythm of ritual pulsed through its walls like a heartbeat. For a pharaoh's life was not his own. It belonged to the gods, to the people, to eternity. Each day was stitched with ceremonies so precise, so unending, that even the moments of rest became rare and precious. At dawn, before the first blush of sunlight touched the horizon, the pharaoh was summoned from his chamber. Priests already waited, their linen robes glowing pale in the dim light, incense curling in thin streams around them. They bathed him in cool water drawn from the Nile, anointing his skin with oils perfumed by lotus and myrrh. His hair was combed, his eyes lined with kohl, his body dressed in linen finer than mist. He was prepared not as a man waking from sleep, but as a god reawakened for the day. The rituals stretched long. In the temple halls, he lifted bread, poured wine, burned incense, spoke hymns. Each gesture had meaning, each word a weight upon which the order of the cosmos was believed to rest. If he faltered, if he hesitated, if he forgot a single movement, the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of truth and harmony, might waver. The Nile might fail to flood. The sun might falter in its rising. The crops might wither. All the universe was bound to his steady hands, his unfaltering voice. To the people, these rituals were wondrous. They saw their pharaoh clothed in gold and linen, his crown gleaming, his presence serene. They saw divinity embodied, the eternal bond between gods and men renewed with each offering. But for the man within, the endless ceremonies pressed heavy like the desert sun. Can you imagine living a life where every breath was measured, every step rehearsed, every word spoken not freely but as part of a script? There were days when the pharaoh longed to break free, to leave the temple hall, to cast aside the scepter, to run barefoot through the gardens as he had in childhood. But such thoughts could never be spoken. They lived only within his mind, fleeting as the shadows cast by flame. Festivals brought even greater demands. During the festival of Opet, he rode in a golden bark carried upon the shoulders of priests, moving from Karnak to Luxor. Crowds filled the streets, their voices rising in chants, their arms lifted high. Musicians played, dancers leapt, the air grew thick with incense and dust. To the people, it was celebration. To the pharaoh, it was performance. Each smile was measured, each gesture timed. His arm grew heavy as he raised it again and again, blessing the people who cheered below. By night, when the celebrations ended, his body ached from the weight of ceremony. His feet, pressed into sandals of gold, longed to be bare upon the earth. His throat, hoarse from hymns, longed for silence. His soul, burdened by divinity, longed for the simplicity of being only a man. Even within the palace, ritual pressed close. Meals were offerings before they were sustenance, served with prayers, consumed with precision. Baths were purifications. Sleep itself was preceded by invocations to guard the soul through dreams. Every action was bound to meaning, until even the smallest gesture felt heavy with eternity. And yet, for all their weight, the rituals could not silence the restlessness within him. Sometimes at dusk, he walked to the palace gardens, where papyrus swayed and lotus bloomed upon still ponds. The air smelled of water and green reeds, the sounds of frogs and crickets rising into the twilight. Here, for a brief moment, he felt a hint of freedom. No priests hovered, no scribes recorded. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes, pretending that he was not king, not God, but simply man. In those moments, the restlessness within him stirred more sharply, reminding him of what was denied. For restlessness is not always loud. It whispers, subtle as the desert wind, reminding the heart that freedom exists, even when it is far away. He remembered his childhood, when the Nile had been his playground, when he had chased dragonflies and felt the mud between his toes. He remembered the laughter of other children, laughter unmeasured, free of expectation. Those memories rose in his mind like cool water, and then faded, leaving thirst behind. Do you feel the ache of such longing? To be surrounded by splendor, yet crave the simplicity of being unseen. The priests reminded him daily that his life was sacred, that his presence sustained the cosmos. And perhaps it was true. Perhaps the universe itself leaned upon the weight of his crown. But within, he longed for even a single hour free of ceremony. To walk unrecognized through the markets. To taste bread warm from an oven without ritual. To sit upon the riverbank and watch the water flow, unburdened by divinity. There were rare moments when he found solace. A musician playing softly in the shadows of the palace. A servant's child laughing as she chased a ball of papyrus fibers across the courtyard. A bird alighting upon the balcony rail, its feathers catching the sun. Small things, fleeting things, but they pierced the veil of ritual, reminding him that life was more than ceremony. And yet, as quickly as they came, they vanished. For always, the call of duty returned. Another ritual, another feast, another judgment, another mask to wear. The restlessness grew sharper with time. It did not break him, for he endured as all pharaohs must, but it carved lines upon his heart, unseen yet deep. At night, he dreamed of deserts wide and endless, where no crown weighed upon his head. He dreamed of the Nile's cool waters, washing away gold and linen, leaving only the man. He dreamed of freedom, fragile and fleeting, like a bird that hovered just beyond his reach. But dawn always came. The priests always waited. The rituals always returned. And so he rose each day to be bathed, anointed, adorned, transformed once more into the God-King the world demanded. Yet within him the restlessness whispered on, a quiet reminder that even a god could long for the simplest of freedoms. The desert has always been Egypt's silent companion. It stretches endlessly beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, a sea of sand that glows gold by day and whispers silver by night. To travelers, it is danger, harsh, empty, unyielding. But to the Pharaoh, trapped within walls of stone and rituals of order, the desert was freedom. In his dreams, he wandered there. The palace faded away, the endless ceremonies, the whispers of priests, the heavy crowns. Instead, the world opened wide, vast and unbound, beneath a sky so deep it seemed to swallow eternity. The sand shifted beneath his bare feet, warm by day, cool by night. The wind carried no courtly secrets, no cautious flattery, only the low, eternal sigh of nature itself. Can you picture him, this God-King, walking alone across dunes that rose and fell like waves? No guards trailed behind him, no vizier shadowed his steps. His robe was simple linen, his sandals thin. His crown, his scepter, his jewels, all were left behind. Here he was only a man. The desert wind spoke in whispers, a language older than kings. It carried the scent of stone, the faint tang of distant herbs clinging to the sand, the coolness of night air settling over the land. He lifted his face to it, closing his eyes, breathing deeply, and for a moment he felt weightless. In his waking life, the Pharaoh was bound by duty. Every step was scripted, every gesture rehearsed, every silence interpreted. But in his dreams of the desert, he was free to move as he pleased, to walk without purpose, to listen without fear. Sometimes, in these dreams, he imagined himself as a traveller, a lone wanderer, unrecognized, making his way from oasis to oasis. He carried only a staff, a water skin, and the quiet joy of anonymity. He joined caravans not as ruler, but as companion. At night, he sat by fires, eating bread baked in embers, listening to songs sung in rough voices, songs not crafted for ceremony, but for survival. He laughed with strangers, his voice unmeasured, his heart unburdened. Other nights, the desert carried him back into memory. He dreamed of his boyhood by the riverbank, before the crown's shadow had fallen upon him. He saw himself chasing dragonflies, splashing into the shallows, laughing as reeds bent beneath his hands. He smelled again the sweet dampness of lotus, the tang of wet mud, the smoke of fishermen's fires rising against twilight. Those memories, softened by time, glowed bright in his dreams, sweeter for being so distant. Do you know this kind of memory? The one that clings, fragile yet eternal, filling the heart with both joy and ache. That was how the Pharaoh felt when the desert wind carried him back to childhood. But the dreams were not only memory, they were yearning. In them, he saw places beyond Egypt, mountains rising against the horizon, seas that stretched farther than thought, forests dense and green. He had never walked such lands, for a pharaoh rarely left his kingdom. Yet in dreams, the desert wind carried him across them all. He felt rain upon his skin, cool and heavy. He smelled pine and cedar, rich and sharp. He listened to waves breaking against rocks, a sound he had never known in waking life, but felt he recognized, as though the world itself whispered to him through his rest. The desert was both mirror and escape. By day, it framed his kingdom, vast and silent. By night, in dreams, it carried his soul away from the heavy walls of ritual, and always the wind was his companion, restless, eternal, untouchable. Sometimes the desert gave him visions, not omens as the priests claimed, but quiet truths. He saw the faces of workers labouring in quarries, their backs bent beneath stone. He saw mothers in villages cradling children, their eyes filled with both hope and weariness. He saw farmers guiding oxen through the mud, their hands rough, their bodies sunburnt. In these visions, he felt both sorrow and connection. For though they saw him as God, he saw them as kin, fragile, mortal, enduring. It was in these dreams that his restlessness softened, not with despair, but with quiet reflection. Perhaps freedom was not something he could grasp in life. Perhaps his role was too heavy, too eternal. But in dreams, he touched it, if only for a breath. Can you imagine the comfort of such dreams? To live bound in ritual, yet find release in visions carried on the night wind? There were times, too, when the desert wind seemed to whisper promises. That one day, when life's weight fell away, his soul would wander free upon the sands. No longer god, no longer king, no longer prisoner of ceremony, just a traveller at last beneath the stars. For the desert sky at night was unlike any other. The stars burned sharp, countless and clear, a river of light pouring endlessly overhead. In his dreams he lay upon the cool sand, arms spread wide, gazing upward. The universe stretched vast above him, eternal and unbound, and for once he felt no expectation pressing upon him. He was not holding the cosmos together, he was part of it, small and infinite, a single breath within eternity. When dawn came, when servants stirred and priests prepared the morning rites, the Pharaoh rose again into his cage of duty. The dreams faded like mist, leaving only the faint echo of wind in his ears. Yet even in waking, he carried them. They were his quiet rebellion, his secret solace, the part of himself that no ritual could touch. He endured the crowns and the ceremonies, the whispers of betrayal, the weight of divinity. But within him, the desert wind always stirred, reminding him that he was more than the mask he wore. And perhaps, in the end, that was his greatest freedom. Not the freedom of body, but of spirit, the freedom to dream, to imagine, to drift beyond palace walls upon the breath of the desert. The throne of Egypt was never empty. Its surface gleamed with gold. Its lions crouched along the legs. Its falcons stretched wings upon the arms. But though the throne was always filled by a figure crowned in splendor, in truth, it was a seat of silence. For no matter how many voices filled the palace, scribes reciting laws, priests chanting hymns, generals reporting victories, the final burden of kingship rested in solitude. And solitude for a pharaoh was both crown and curse. From the earliest years of his reign, the young ruler understood that loss was part of power. Brothers disappeared into whispers of rivalry. Friends from boyhood faded away, some into exile, some into the quiet erasure of court politics. Even wives, bound by ceremony, lived behind veils of duty. And children, beloved, fragile children, were sometimes claimed by fever, by accident, by the mysteries of life that no crown could shield them from. Can you imagine the weight of such grief carried in silence? For the Pharaoh could not wail as ordinary men wailed, tearing their clothes, beating their chests, collapsing into arms of comfort. His grief had to be dignified, ritualized, framed in the mask of divinity. He must stand tall as priests chanted prayers, his face calm, his gestures serene, even as his heart cracked within him. The palace walls held echoes of absence. A chamber once filled with a child's laughter grew quiet. A courtyard, once alive with games, stood still. Servants passed more softly, as though silence itself had become sacred. Yet beyond those walls, the people saw only the unbroken image, their God-King shining, eternal, flawless. In private, the throne itself became the sharpest reminder. When the Pharaoh sat upon it, hearing the endless petitions of nobles and priests, he often felt the emptiness at his side, the space where a brother once would have stood, where a son might one day have leaned, where companions might have shared his burden. Instead, there was only the Vizier, steady and unreadable, and the endless rows of courtiers whose loyalty was always uncertain. The silence was heavy, yet it could not be spoken aloud. At night, in his chamber, he sometimes sat awake long after the lamps had burned low. The painted stars above his bed shimmered faintly in the torchlight, and he stared at them, letting his mind wander. He thought of those he had lost, their faces soft in memory. He whispered their names, not as Pharaoh, but as father, as brother. as man. The silence that answered was both painful and gentle, a reminder that even kings must walk through grief alone. There were moments too when he walked the palace gardens in solitude. Lotus floated upon still ponds, papyrus swayed in the evening air, the Nile gleamed faintly beyond the walls. He let the breeze brush against his skin, carrying the scents of water and earth. In that quiet, the voices of ceremony faded, and he allowed himself to feel sorrow openly, if only for a breath. The frogs croaking at dusk, the rustle of reeds, the cry of birds. These sounds filled the silence more kindly than hymns ever could. Have you ever known such a silence? The kind that is not empty, but full of memory, full of longing, full of what can never be spoken aloud. That was the Pharaoh's throne, a place of power carved from silence, weighted with absence. Grief changed him. He grew more careful, more cautious. Where once he might have spoken quickly, he now paused. Where once he might have trusted, he now watched. The silence taught him patience, but also distance. For to love too deeply was to risk loss, and to reveal grief was to risk weakness. And so, slowly, the man within the crown grew quieter, more hidden, less willing to let his heart be seen. And yet, even within the silence, there was strength. The people did not see his grief, but they felt his endurance. They saw a ruler who stood steady even when storms swept through his household, who held the balance of Ma'at even when his own heart was unbalanced. They believed him eternal, for he never faltered before them. And in that way, his silence became not only burden but gift, a shield for his people, though it cost him dearly. Still, the throne remained cold. Even in moments of triumph, when envoys bowed, when soldiers presented spoils of war, when festivals filled the streets with joy, the Pharaoh often sat quietly, his smile measured, his heart distant. He thought of those who were gone, who could not share in the glory. The applause of thousands could not replace the laughter of one child. The hymns of priests could not fill the absence of a friend's voice. The silence of power is one of the deepest truths of kingship. Surrounded by people, yet alone. Praised by thousands, yet unheard. Crowned as God, yet grieving as man. In the stillness of his chamber, he sometimes found comfort in small, human things. The warmth of a cat curling at his feet. The laughter of a servant child echoing faintly through the courtyard. The soft hum of a musician's harp drifting down a corridor. These fleeting sounds broke through the silence, reminding him that even within grief, life endured. And perhaps that was the lesson the throne taught him, harsher than any tutor or priest. Power could not shield against sorrow. Ceremony could not replace love. Divinity could not erase humanity. The silence of loss was eternal, yet within it, he still lived, still ruled, still carried the weight of Egypt upon his shoulders. Can you imagine it? To sit upon a throne gleaming with gold, while within your heart you hear only silence. To be remembered in stone as eternal, while in truth you were shaped most deeply by the grief no inscription would ever record. The throne of silence was heavy, yet he bore it. For Egypt endured through him, and so he endured for Egypt. And though history would carve his likeness with perfect serenity, though temples would sing of him as unshaken and divine, the truth, whispered only to the night, was this. Behind the crown, beneath the mask, he was a man sitting in silence, longing for the voices that would never return. The monuments of Egypt rose slowly, stone by stone, beneath the blazing sun. They grew from the desert floor like mountains shaped by human hands. temples adorned with soaring columns, statues taller than houses, pyramids reaching for the heavens. To the people, they were proof of eternity, monuments of glory carved with the name of their god-king. To the Pharaoh himself, they were pride, power, and a burden that weighed heavier with each passing year. From the moment of his coronation, the building of monuments began. Architects unfurled scrolls of papyrus covered with sketches. Priests declared omens, pointing to favorable days when the gods blessed construction. Overseers gathered thousands of workers, farmers during the flood season, artisans with chisels, masons with hammers, haulers with ropes thick as tree trunks. The desert filled with the sounds of labor. Stone cracked beneath copper tools. Sledges groaned across sand. Voices rose in chants to keep rhythm as blocks weighing tons were dragged into place. The air grew hot with dust. The workers' skin burned by the relentless sun, their backs bent beneath endless loads. From his palace, the Pharaoh watched progress. Reports were brought daily. So many blocks raised, so many statues carved, so many men injured, so many dead. His name would be etched in stone, sung by priests long after his body turned to dust. Yet within, a question stirred. Was this glory his own, or was it carved from the sweat and blood of others? Can you imagine the weight of such knowledge? To see monuments rise in your honor, knowing each stone carried the cost of human lives. In public, the Pharaoh smiled. He walked among the half-built walls, blessing the work, thanking the gods for strength. He allowed the people to believe that these monuments were divine gifts, eternal testaments to harmony. But in private, when he sat in the silence of his chamber, he remembered the faces of workers, the boy scarcely grown, pressed into labor beside his father. The old man, bones weary, carrying burdens meant for younger shoulders. The mother left behind in a village, waiting for the husband who might never return. He dreamed sometimes of walking among them unseen. To hear their voices, not in ceremony, but in truth. Did they curse his name as they strained beneath the weight of stone? Did they believe the gods would reward them for their suffering? Or did they long only to return home, to fields and families, to the ordinary joys denied them? The monuments rose slowly, but they rose endlessly. No sooner was one temple completed than another was planned. No sooner was a statue raised than a larger one was begun. Eternity demanded permanence, and permanence demanded stone. For the Pharaoh's reign must be recorded not only in papyrus, which could burn, but in rock, which endured as mountains did. And so, the quarries groaned year after year. The Nile carried blocks upon barges, and the desert floor shook with the echoes of labor. At times, the Pharaoh walked among the construction sites. Priests flanked him, guards cleared paths, workers bent low as he passed. To them, his presence was divine blessing, a reminder that their toil was sacred. But as he gazed at their bowed heads, their calloused hands, their bodies lean with hunger and heat, his heart ached. He knew that while they built eternity for him, their own lives slipped away unmarked. No walls would bear their names. No statues would carry their likeness. Their only immortality lay in the sweat that darkened the stones of his monuments. Have you ever wondered how it feels to be honored by the world, yet haunted by the cost of that honor? That was the Pharaoh's burden. At night, when dreams carried him into the desert winds, he sometimes saw the faces of the workers more vividly than the gods. He saw their eyes, shining with fatigue. He heard their chants, rhythmic yet weary. He felt the ache of their backs as though it were his own. And he wondered if, when he died, their souls would meet him in the afterlife, not as servants, not as worshippers, but as equals, demanding to know whether their suffering had been worth his eternity. The priests reassured him. "It is ma'at," they said. "It is order. The people serve, and through their service the gods are honored. The monuments will stand forever, and so too will Egypt." Their voices were calm, confident, unyielding. Yet the Pharaoh, in his quiet heart, questioned, could divinity truly demand so much suffering? Or was this eternity built not by the gods, but by men seeking to preserve their power? Still, the building never ceased. Temples stretched higher, statues grew taller, pyramids climbed toward the sky, and with each stone laid, the burden deepened. Do you feel the paradox? Pride and sorrow, glory and guilt, bound together in every block of stone. The Pharaoh knew that one day, long after his body was wrapped in linen and sealed within a tomb, these monuments would still stand. Travelers would gaze upon them, their voices filled with awe. Priests would chant his name as though he still lived. Generations would believe he was eternal. And yet, none would remember the workers whose hands bled, whose lives ended beneath the weight of those same stones. In this way, immortality felt hollow. For what is eternity if it is built upon forgotten lives? Sometimes he imagined a different monument, not one carved in stone, but one built in memory, a kingdom where the people thrived, where fields yielded harvest, where children grew strong, where joy outweighed suffering. That, he thought, would be the truest legacy. But such monuments were fragile, unrecorded, easily lost to time. Only stone endured, and so stone consumed his reign. As years passed, the monuments multiplied. Columns rose in rows like forests of stone. Walls bloomed with painted hieroglyphs. Obelisks pierced the sky, their tips gilded to catch the rising sun. They were beautiful, magnificent, eternal. And yet, to the Pharaoh, they were also heavy, not in weight of stone, but in weight of conscience. Perhaps that was why, in his private prayers, he rarely asked the gods for glory. Instead, he asked for forgiveness. Forgiveness for the burden placed upon his people. Forgiveness for the suffering that built his eternity. Forgiveness for being both man and God, caught in a role that demanded monuments, even when his heart longed for mercy. The builder's burden was his own, and though history would carve him in stone, serene and eternal, the truth whispered only to the night was this. Behind every monument that bore his name, there stood a mountain of human lives. And he, more than anyone, felt their weight. The temples of Egypt stood taller than most palaces, vast and eternal, their columns carved with lotus and papyrus, their walls painted with gods who watched in silence. To the people, they were sanctuaries of hope, where prayers rose like smoke and blessings descended like rain. To the Pharaoh, they were both stage and cage. For though the temples magnified his divinity, they also bound him to endless cycles of ritual that left little space for his own heart. From dawn until dusk, the temple pressed its shadow over his life. The mornings began in chambers thick with incense. Priests, shaven-headed and draped in linen, moved silently through sacred halls, their feet bare against the cool stone. They prepared offerings of bread, beer, fruit, and wine. They purified statues of gods with water drawn from the Nile, chanting hymns so ancient that even scribes barely understood their oldest words. Then, when all was ready, they summoned the Pharaoh. He entered clad in gold and linen, his crown gleaming, his scepter steady in his hand. The people outside believed This was the moment the gods walked among them, that their king was Horus incarnate, Osiris reborn, Ra's chosen. But to the man within, it was ceremony, exact and unyielding. He lifted bread not for his own hunger, but as offering. He poured wine not for his own lips, but for the gods who drank only in symbol. His voice rose in hymns that did not belong to his heart, but to eternity. Can you imagine living a life where even prayer was not your own? Where every word you spoke to the gods was scripted, rehearsed, demanded? Never the quiet murmurings of the soul, but the echo of tradition. The temples were magnificent. Columns soared high, painted in bright blues and reds, their capitals shaped like blooming lotus. Sunlight fell in golden beams through small openings, catching upon incense smoke so that the very air seemed alive with divine presence. Walls were covered in carvings, gods with falcon heads, jackal heads, lion heads, gods holding scepters and ankhs, gods judging, blessing, warning. At night, torchlight flickered across them, as though they moved, as though they breathed. To stand within such halls was awe-inspiring, and yet, to the Pharaoh, it was also suffocating. For each god etched upon the stone demanded something of him, an offering, a ritual, a sacrifice of time, of freedom, of self. The gods never slept, and so their king could never rest. Priests guided his every step. Here, bow. Here, lift your hands. Here, speak these words, no other. And so he obeyed, as he must. For without the priests, his divinity could be questioned. Without the rituals, Ma'at itself, the sacred balance of order and truth, might falter. The people would fear. The Nile might withhold its flood. Chaos might rise from the desert. His role was not optional. It was eternal. But in the stillness of his own mind, he longed for another way. Sometimes, as he walked the shadowed halls, he gazed upon the statues of gods and wondered, did they see him truly? Did Ra, blazing across the sky, know the weight of the crown pressing into his skull? Did Osiris, lord of the dead, understand the loneliness of ruling the living? Did Isis, the divine mother, hear his whispered prayers at night? Prayers not spoken in ritual but in desperation. He longed to speak freely to them, not as Pharaoh, but as man, to tell them of his doubts, his fatigue, his grief. But such words never passed his lips. Instead, he spoke the ancient hymns, polished smooth by generations, words that filled the temple air like echoes of echoes. The festivals were the heaviest. During the festival of Opet, when the god Amun's statue was carried from Karnak to Luxor, the pharaoh himself walked or rode beside it. The streets filled with thousands, their voices rising in chants, their arms lifted toward him. Musicians played, dancers spun, incense thickened the air until it clung to the throat. To the people, it was joy. To him, it was burden. His smile was practiced, his gestures rehearsed, his presence demanded. Even his joy was ritual, and yet, amid the grandeur, there were moments of piercing humanity. He saw a child lifted onto her father's shoulders, her eyes wide with awe as she watched him pass. He saw old women kneeling in dust, their lips moving in prayers for health, for harvest, for sons returned from war. He saw men bowing, their backs bent, their faces lined with hardship. And in those faces, he saw truth. They did not need him as God. They needed him as man, protector, provider, ruler, who cared not only for temples but for fields and families. Still, the priests reminded him, "You are not man, you are divine." And so he continued, day after day, year after year, binding himself tighter to the rituals, But the restlessness never left. At night, when the ceremonies ended, he sometimes sat alone in a darkened chamber of the temple, the statues looming above him. He stared at their painted eyes, unblinking, eternal, and whispered words that no priest could hear. Not hymns, not rituals, just fragments of his own soul. I am weary. I am lonely. I am afraid. The gods did not answer. Only silence echoed back, broken by the faint crackle of torches and the distant hiss of sand outside. Can you feel the ache of such silence? To pour out your heart and hear nothing in return. Yet even in that silence, he found a kind of peace. For at least in those hidden moments, he was honest, if not with others, then with himself. The temples endured, casting their shadows across his reign. They were beautiful, eternal, awe-inspiring. But for the Pharaoh, they were also chains, binding him to rituals that consumed his days and left little of himself untouched. He lived in their shadow, and though the world saw only splendor, the man behind the crown knew the truth. Divinity was not freedom. It was the heaviest captivity of all. And yet, he endured. He lifted bread, poured wine, burned incense, spoke hymns. He stood steady, serene, unyielding. For he knew that though the temples bound him, they also bound Egypt together. The people needed the shadow of the gods as much as they needed the light of the sun. And so he gave himself to the temple, day after day, year after year, until he no longer knew where man ended and God began, until the shadow and the light were one. The desert could be silent for months, its winds calm, its dunes lying still under the endless sun. And then, without warning, a storm would rise. Sand would lift into the sky like a curtain, the horizon vanishing, the air thick with dust and fury. To live in Egypt was to know that calm and chaos could change places in a breath. And so too was it in the kingdom. For beneath the splendor of temples and monuments, beneath the hymns sung to the Pharaoh as God, there was always the possibility of rebellion waiting to rise like a storm. The Pharaoh knew this well. He had been raised with stories of kings who lost their thrones not to foreign invaders, but to their own people. He had heard the whispered names of rulers whose reigns ended in blood, their statues toppled, their cartouches erased from stone. Egypt was strong, but its strength rested on fragile foundations. The Nile's flood, the people's labor, the priesthood's loyalty. If one faltered, if one turned, the kingdom could fracture. When the Nile failed to rise in full measure, fields withered, grain grew scarce, families tightened their belts, hunger pressing sharp against their bones. In such times, whispers grew louder. Farmers muttered that the gods were displeased. Priests warned that the king had erred in his rituals. And those whispers, though soft at first, carried like sand upon the wind. Can you imagine the weight of such fear? To know that the rise of the river was not only a matter of nature, but a measure of your worth as king. To stand upon a balcony overlooking the water, watching its level fall short, and feel the silent judgment of thousands pressing upon your back. The Pharaoh saw the signs, a market too quiet, the chatter of merchants subdued, a group of men in a village standing too close, their voices low, their eyes sharp when soldiers passed. A prayer offered without conviction, lips moving with duty rather than faith. These were small things, fragile threads, but he knew they could weave together into a storm. The court carried its own unease. Generals spoke of unrest on the borders, of desert tribes restless, of foreign envoys testing Egypt's strength. The Vizier brought reports of grain stores dwindling, of taxes harder to collect. Priests reminded him that the gods required more offerings, more festivals, more proof of his devotion. Each voice pulled in a different direction, each voice demanding. And behind them all was the unspoken truth. If rebellion rose, it was the Pharaoh who would be blamed. He walked the palace halls with serenity, as he must, but within him the fear coiled tightly. Not fear of battle, for he had armies, he had generals, he had chariots sharp as falcons. It was a deeper fear, harder to face, the fear of losing the hearts of his people. For a king who lost their love, their faith, their obedience, was a king already dethroned no matter how high his monuments rose. At night, he dreamed of sandstorms. He saw crowds shouting, faces blurred with anger, hands raised not in worship but in defiance. He saw torches against temple walls, statues struck with hammers, his name chiseled away. He woke breathless, the vision sharp, the silence of his chamber heavy with warning. Rebellion was not always loud at first. Sometimes it began with hunger, a village refusing to pay grain, a group of workers abandoning their posts, a priest questioning a ritual too boldly. Sometimes it began with envy. A noble passed over for favor, a brother denied power, a general kept from glory. Small sparks, each one. But sparks could grow into fire when fanned by discontent. The Pharaoh remembered walking through the great hall of columns, the air cool, the torches flickering, and hearing the faint sound of sandals echo behind him. He turned, but the corridor was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. The sense of being watched, measured, weighed. Was it only his own fear, or were there eyes in the shadows waiting? He trusted his guards, but even trust felt fragile. For gold could buy loyalty, and promises could bend hearts. He trusted the Vizier, but the Vizier's influence was vast. His loyalty bound not only to the man, but to the throne itself. He trusted the priests, but they too served gods that might demand another king if omens shifted. Who then could he truly trust, when even those closest to him carried their own ambitions? The people outside the palace lived with hardships the Pharaoh could only imagine. He saw glimpses of it when he travelled. Farmers bent in the fields, children playing in dust, women carrying jars heavy with water. He watched their faces as they looked upon him, some filled with awe, some with weariness, some with something sharper, harder to read. And he wondered, when night fell and the stars rose, what words they spoke of him. Did they pray for him, or did they curse him quietly, their voices swallowed by the desert wind? Have you ever felt the unease of knowing that those who smile in daylight might murmur against you in the dark? That was the Pharaoh's life, each day, each breath. The fear of rebellion shaped his choices. He gave gifts to temples, so priests would bless his name. He forgave taxes in villages struck hardest by famine, though it strained the treasuries. He raised monuments higher, hoping they would prove his strength, though in his heart he knew stone could not silence hunger. He ordered festivals, music and feasts, bread handed to the crowds, beer flowing freely, moments of joy to soften the edge of discontent. And still, in the quiet of his chamber, he wondered if it was enough. Sometimes he longed to walk among his people unrecognized, to sit with them in their courtyards, to hear their voices without fear, to know what they truly felt. But a Pharaoh could not walk unseen. His face was carved on every temple wall, painted upon every shrine, sung in every hymn. He was God to them, and God could never become man in their eyes. And so he remained apart, his restlessness growing, his fear sharpening, his solitude deepening. The desert wind carried rumors, always. Whispers of tribes stirring on the borders. Whispers of nobles scheming within the palace. whispers of priests interpreting omens in ways that pressed upon his reign, whispers of common men, tired of hunger, questioning whether the gods still favoured their king. Whispers were like grains of sand. One meant little, but many together could bury. And so he listened closely, straining to catch what was said in corners, what was written in hurried letters, what was left unsaid in council chambers. For rebellion was not only swords and fire, it was silence, it was absence. It was the look in a man's eyes when he bowed, too cold, too still. At times he thought of the workers who built his monuments. He wondered what words they spoke when their backs ached, when the sun burned them raw, when their hands bled upon the stone. Did they build in pride or in resentment? Did they see his name carved deep and feel awe or bitterness? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps they only longed for rest. The builder's burden, the priest's demands, the general's ambitions, the people's hunger, all of it pressed upon him. And though he stood tall in public within himself, he felt like a man standing upon shifting sand, steady only for as long as the wind allowed. In dreams the sandstorms returned, faces blurred by dust, voices shouting, monuments toppling. He reached for his crown, but the wind carried it away, lost among the dunes. And when he woke, he lay in silence, staring at the painted stars upon his ceiling, listening to the faint sound of wind outside, and wondering whether dreams were warnings or merely fears given shape. Rebellion might never come. Perhaps his reign would endure in peace, his monuments completed, his tomb sealed in splendour. But the fear of it was constant, as much a companion as the crown itself. For power, he knew, was never secure. It was only borrowed, only held so long as the people believed, so long as the gods were thought to bless him, so long as the winds of the desert stayed calm. And so he endured, each day, each ritual, each moment. He smiled at festivals, blessed the people, stood steady before the priests. He gave no sign of fear, no hint of doubt, for the illusion must remain unbroken. The God-King could not tremble, even when storms brewed unseen. But within him, the silence grew heavy, and the restlessness sharper. He was a man seated upon a throne of gold, yet surrounded by sandstorms only he could feel. Storms of whispers, storms of hunger, storms of rebellion waiting perhaps to rise. The scarab beetle was small, no larger than a thumb. Its shell gleamed dark and iridescent, catching the sunlight in flashes of green and blue. To ordinary eyes, it was an insect rolling balls of dung across the earth, humble and unremarkable. But to Egypt, it was divine, for in the scarab's endless labour, the priests saw the image of the sun itself, rolled across the sky each day, reborn each dawn, eternal in its cycle. The Pharaoh wore scarabs often. They were carved in stone, in turquoise, in lapis lazuli. They were pressed into seals, buried within tombs, inscribed with spells to guard the soul in the afterlife. They appeared upon his jewellery, woven into amulets placed near his heart. To his people, these scarabs were symbols of eternity, of renewal, of life's endless circle. But to him, they carried something more. A secret reflection of his own burdens, a truth no priest dared speak aloud. He remembered once in his youth, crouching in a palace garden, watching a scarab at work. The beetle rolled its sphere with tireless persistence, legs digging into the soil, body straining against the weight. Again and again it faltered, the ball slipping, tumbling aside, and again it returned, steady, relentless, never abandoning its task. To a child, it was curiosity. To the young Pharaoh, grown now into manhood, it became symbol. For was he not like the Scarab, pushing endlessly against the weight of the world, against burdens that rolled back upon him no matter how many times he advanced? Can you picture him there, beneath the gold of his crown, standing in temple halls thick with incense, thinking of a beetle in the dust? To the people, he was radiant, eternal. But within, he knew himself to be the Scarab, small, mortal, straining against endless weight. The priests exalted the Scarab as sacred, tying it to the god Khepri, who pushed the sun across the heavens each day. They said the beetle was a promise, that death was not an end but a rebirth, that the soul would rise as the sun rose, shining again in eternity. The Pharaoh listened, nodding, accepting their words with the dignity required of him. Yet in the silence of his heart, the Scarab's promise felt different, for he did not see rebirth in its labour. He saw endurance. He saw struggle. He saw a creature too small for its burden, and yet carrying it still. That was the secret of the Scarab. It was not only eternity, it was survival. At night, when sleep was restless, he sometimes held a carved scarab in his hand, its smooth stone surface cool against his palm. He traced its lines with his fingers, thinking of its meaning. Did it protect him from curses, as priests claimed? Did it bind his soul to the gods? Or was it simply a reminder that life itself was struggle, and that endurance, not glory, was the truest measure of divinity? He thought of his people, farmers bending over fields, workers hauling stone, mothers grinding grain, fishermen casting nets. Were they not scarabs too, rolling their burdens each day, never ceasing, never resting, carrying the weight of survival upon their backs? Their lives were not eternal in stone, but eternal in labour. And he, though crowned as God, was bound to the same truth. The Scarab appeared often in dreams. He saw them crawling across the sand, countless and glimmering, their shells like stars fallen to earth. He saw them roll spheres of light instead of dung, pushing suns across the desert floor, glowing with warmth. Sometimes they swarmed over his monuments, climbing walls and statues, covering hieroglyphs until even his name vanished beneath their bodies. At other times they carried him gently upon their backs, lifting him above the ground, bearing him not toward glory but toward release. The dreams left him thoughtful, heavy with meaning. For dreams, the priest said, were messages of the gods, but perhaps they were messages of the heart, truths spoken in symbols, whispers that could not be voiced in daylight. The Scarab also carried shadows. For just as it promised eternity, it reminded him of burial. Scarabs were placed in tombs, pressed against the chest of the dead, carved with spells to silence the heart's confession before Osiris. They promised safe passage through the underworld, protection from judgment. Yet the Pharaoh knew no amulet, no spell, no symbol could erase the truth of a man's soul. What secrets lay hidden in his heart? What fears? What doubts? What longings? Would they not still weigh against him in eternity? He imagined the day of judgment. The scales before Osiris, his heart weighed against the feather of Maat. And in that moment, perhaps it would not be his monuments, his battles, his rituals that mattered, but his endurance, the simple, scarab-like persistence of living, of bearing burdens, of carrying the weight given to him without surrender. Perhaps that was the truest secret. Do you feel it, this quiet truth? That glory fades, monuments crumble, names vanish, but endurance itself is divine. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert shimmered gold, The Pharaoh walked alone in the gardens. The air was heavy with the scent of lotus. The Nile gleamed softly in the distance. He saw a scarab upon the path, rolling its burden with slow, steady effort. He paused, watching. For a moment, king and beetle shared the same silence. One carried the weight of a world upon his shoulders. The other carried the weight of survival across the earth. And in that moment, he felt kinship. Not as God, not as king, but as creature among creatures. He bent, gently lifting the beetle and its burden, setting it aside upon safer ground. Then he straightened, the crown still heavy upon his brow, the scepter still in his hand. He turned back toward the palace, the weight of duty pressing as always. Yet in his heart lingered the scarab's secret, that even the smallest life, in its persistence, mirrored eternity. The people saw only the symbol, the carved scarab, the promise of rebirth. But the Pharaoh carried the hidden truth, that endurance was the essence of existence, that survival was its own form of divinity. And so, when he lay down to sleep that night, the scarab still resting cool against his palm, he whispered not a hymn, but a simple truth to himself. I will endure. And the desert wind, stirring faintly through the shutters, seemed to answer in kind. The tomb was always waiting. From the first days of his reign, even as celebrations filled the streets and garlands of lotus crowned his head, architects and masons were already summoned to design the place where he would lie forever. While he lived in palaces painted bright with colour, his tomb was being carved deep into rock, its walls planned with images of gods, its passages designed to guide him through the underworld. It was said to be an honour, a preparation for eternity. But to the Pharaoh, it was also a shadow, a constant reminder that his life was not his own, but a slow burial in advance. Day after day, while he sat upon the throne, while he led rituals in temples, while he blessed harvests and armies, the tomb grew silently beneath the earth. Stone chipped away under the hands of workers, passages lengthened, chambers expanded. Scribes planned what scenes would be painted, him offering gifts to Ra, him kneeling before Osiris, him rising with the morning sun. The tomb was an eternal script, written in stone, that declared what he must be forever. Can you imagine living each day knowing that, somewhere in the hills, men carved your death house as you breathed? That with every festival you celebrated, with every decision you made, with every breath you took, the walls of your burial chamber grew closer to completion. The tomb was not only a place of rest, it was a cage of expectation. It told him how eternity would remember him. Serene, eternal, divine. Not restless, not weary, not human. The man he truly was, the man who lay awake at night longing for freedom, who felt fear of rebellion, who carried grief for lost children. None of that would appear in the painted walls. Eternity was carved as perfection, while his truth was buried in silence. In a way, he was already being buried. Wrapped in linen each morning by servants, his body perfumed with oils, his face painted with kohl. These were rituals of life, but also of death. Did they not echo the mummification that would come when breath left his chest? Each day was preparation, each day a rehearsal for what was inevitable. The palace itself felt like a tomb at times. Its stone walls were cool, its corridors echoing with footsteps that faded quickly into silence. Statues of gods stood tall and unyielding, their eyes unblinking, their hands frozen in gestures of blessing. Lamps flickered, casting shadows across painted walls. Even in life, He walked through chambers that felt carved for eternity, rather than for living warmth. And so, the Pharaoh lived as if already entombed, honored, exalted, but sealed away from freedom, wrapped in expectations, heavier than stone. There were nights when he sat in silence, thinking of those who came before him, their tombs stretched across the desert, pyramids that pierced the sky, hidden chambers cut deep into rock, temples aligned with the sun. They were remembered, yes, their names still spoken, their monuments still standing. But what of the men themselves? Could any inscription, any carving, capture their secret hearts? Or had they too lived as he lived now, already buried before death, already silenced by divinity's mask? He thought of the workers who carved his tomb. In darkness lit only by flickering lamps, they cut stone, painted walls, etched hieroglyphs. Their lives would end in obscurity, their names unremembered. Yet in some strange way, they were freer than he. They laughed together as they worked, sang chants to lighten their burden, told stories in the dark. Their labor was heavy, but it was their own. His labor, though wrapped in gold, felt heavier still, for it was eternal and unrelenting. Do you feel the ache of such a paradox? That a god-king, surrounded by splendor, could envy the laughter of men in dusty tunnels. The rituals of death shadowed his life. Priests recited prayers to Osiris in his presence, reminding him of judgment yet to come. Amulets were crafted, scarabs inscribed, linens prepared, not only for his present but for his future body. Perfume jars waited to hold the sense of eternity. Coffins were shaped, gilded, polished. Even as he breathed, death was planned in detail, and so he carried the sense that he was living within layers of burial. He sat upon a golden throne, but it felt at times like a sarcophagus. He wore crowns, but they pressed heavy as funerary masks. He walked through corridors painted with gods, but they seemed already the walls of his tomb. He smiled at festivals, but the joy was thin, muffled, wrapped like a body in linen. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the heartbeat there, steady and fragile. He wondered how many more days it would last, how many more mornings he would rise to be wrapped and painted, to be offered as God, to endure rituals that buried him in divinity. He wondered if his heart would be lighter than the feather of Ma'at, or if the silence of his doubts and fears would weigh it down. The thought of judgment lingered often, for the priests promised he would live forever, that his tomb would ensure safe passage, that his monuments would keep his name alive. But what if eternity was not so easily bought? What if no tomb, no scarab, no ritual could silence the truth of his heart? Would Osiris see him not as god-king, but as weary man, restless, fearful, longing for freedom? Would the scales tip against him, casting him into nothingness? The more he thought, the more he realized. He was already being judged, not by gods unseen, but by himself, each night, each silence, each dream. He weighed his own heart, felt its heaviness, feared its truths. And yet still, he endured. He walked through temples, his voice calm, his gestures precise. He stood before crowds, his smile serene. He ruled with dignity, with patience, with silence. The burial continued, each day another layer of linen, another stone in his eternal tomb. But he did not falter, for he knew that though he felt buried, though he felt trapped within eternity before his life had ended, he was still the axis upon which Egypt turned. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to live your own burial? To breathe within walls that feel carved for death? To move through rituals that feel like embalming? to carry eternity upon your shoulders before your heart has stopped beating. That was the Pharaoh's truth. And so, when he lay upon his bed of linen, lamps flickering low, silence pressing in, he sometimes whispered to himself, "I am alive still." He spoke it as reminder, as defiance, as fragile hope. The tomb would wait, the burial would come. But for now, his breath still filled his chest, his eyes still saw the river, his ears still heard the music of flutes drifting through the night. Life, though wrapped in shadow, was still his. And he clung to it, quietly, fiercely, with all the endurance of the scarab that pushed its burden through the dust. The tomb was finished at last. Deep within the rock, hidden from the sun, its chambers stretched like a silent river into the earth. The walls glowed faintly with colours of painted gods. Osiris with green skin and calm eyes, Isis with wings outstretched, Ra sailing in his golden bark across the sky. Hieroglyphs flowed like prayers, their lines eternal, their words meant to guide the soul. Chests were filled with treasures, jars sealed with oils, amulets placed carefully in linen wrappings. Everything was ready, waiting, prepared for the moment when breath would leave the Pharaoh's body. And yet, though the tomb waited, he still lived. Each day he rose, carried the crown, endured the rituals, blessed his people. Each night he lay awake beneath painted stars, listening to the silence that grew heavier with each passing season. He knew that his years were shortening. He felt it in his bones, in the weariness that clung to him, in the way his breath sometimes caught. He had lived long within the shadow of burial. Now he felt its nearness, close and undeniable. But with nearness came a strange calm. For much of his reign, he had carried fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of rebellion, fear of the gods' judgment. Now, as the years folded into age, that fear softened. It was not that the dangers vanished. Whispers still stirred in the court. Storms still rose in the desert. Priests still demanded rituals without end. But the Pharaoh had grown beyond them. He had carried his burdens long enough to see them for what they were. Sandstorms, loud and blinding but passing. What remained eternal was not fear, but silence. And in that silence, he began to hear whispers, not of plots, not of curses, not of rebellion, but of peace. He walked more often to the gardens now, where the Nile's breath touched the air and the lotus flowers opened at dusk. He sat beneath sycamore trees, listening to the rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, the distant cries of fishermen. He watched the scarabs roll their burdens still, steady and patient. Life continued, endlessly, without crowns, without thrones. And he, once restless, now found comfort in its simplicity. Can you imagine the relief of such quiet? After years of endless voices, endless rituals, endless demands. To sit at last in the soft hush of twilight and let the world simply be. He thought often of those he had lost. Children whose laughter had faded from the palace halls. Companions whose voices no longer echoed. Wives who had grown silent behind veils. He thought of their faces, softened by memory, and wondered if he would see them again beyond the tomb. The priests promised eternity, reunion, fields of reeds where the blessed walked together forever. He did not know if it was true, but he hoped. And sometimes, in the stillness, he felt them close, not as ghosts, not as visions, but as warmth, as presence, as whispers in his heart. The tomb no longer frightened him. Its walls would close, yes. Its silence would deepen. But he had lived long in silence already. The difference was only that beyond death, he would no longer carry the weight of crowns, no longer perform the endless rituals, no longer mask his heart behind divinity. Beyond the tomb, he might at last be only himself. He imagined it often. To step into the hall of judgment, to stand before Osiris, his heart laid upon the scales, the feather of Ma'at shining pure, his heart trembling in balance. He did not know which way it would fall, but he thought of his endurance, his patience, his quiet humanity hidden behind the mask. Perhaps the gods would see not perfection, but persistence. Perhaps that would be enough. And if it was not, if his heart proved heavy, still, he would have lived. He would have endured the burdens of divinity, endured the solitude of rule, endured the endless weight of stone. He had carried his crown like the Scarab carried its burden, and that, he thought, was its own kind of holiness. At night, he dreamed more gently. No longer of sandstorms, no longer of rebellion. Instead, he dreamed of rivers. He saw the Nile shining beneath moonlight, its waters endless, carrying him forward. He saw the desert wind lifting him, not in storm, but in soft currents, bearing him lightly toward the horizon. He saw the Scarab still, rolling its sphere of light, and in its glow he felt peace. When he woke, he carried those dreams with him into the day. The rituals continued, but he no longer resisted them. He performed them softly, steadily, knowing they would soon end. The priests sang, the people bowed, the Vizier whispered counsel, and the Pharaoh smiled, not as mask, but as man who knew his time was drawing to its close. Have you ever felt that quiet surrender? When fear falls away and what remains is acceptance, not heavy, not bitter, but calm, like water flowing gently downstream. That was the Pharaoh's heart now. The day would come when his body would be wrapped in linen, his chest pressed with scarabs, his tomb sealed in stone. But he no longer feared that day, for he knew that though the world would remember him as God, eternity would know him as man. And perhaps, in that truth, he would finally find freedom. He imagined his people standing in the streets when the news spread. They would weep. They would sing hymns. They would raise their hands to the sky. Some would mourn sincerely, others with duty. But in the quiet corners of villages, mothers would still grind grain. Fathers would still cast nets. Children would still laugh in dust. Life would continue, as it always had, as it always would. And that too was comfort. For the kingdom did not belong to him alone. It belonged to the Nile, to the people, to time itself. The tomb would whisper of his eternity, but the true whispers, the ones that mattered, would be softer still. They would be carried in the wind that swept across the desert, in the river that rose each year, in the laughter of children not yet born. His name might fade, his monuments might crumble, but the life he had endured would ripple onward, as quiet and endless as the whispers of the night. And so, in his final seasons, the Pharaoh no longer saw himself as buried before death. He saw himself as preparing to join the eternal cycle, like the Scarab, like the sun, like the river. His life, his reign, his burdens, his silence. All of it was only one turn of the wheel. Beyond it lay peace. When he closed his eyes for the last time, he did not see crowns or thrones or tombs. He saw the Nile gleaming under starlight. He saw the desert stretching wide, the wind soft upon his face. He saw the Scarab rolling its sphere, steady, eternal. And in that vision, he felt himself lighten, as though the weight of stone had at last fallen away. The tomb sealed behind him, silent and eternal. The world outside moved on, the river flowed, the people endured. And in the quiet of eternity, his whispers joined the wind, not heavy with fear, not bound by crowns, but soft, gentle, timeless. Sleep well, he might have whispered to himself. Sleep well, as Egypt sleeps beneath the stars, as the river flows, as eternity carries on. For the burdens are lifted, the silence is softened, and at last, peace is found.